The greatest story ever told might just be the greatest lie ever sold. For nearly 2,000 years, the story of Jesus Christ has shaped civilizations, inspired countless souls, and fundamentally altered the course of human history. But what if everything you thought you knew about Christianity's origins was deliberately constructed fiction? What if the most influential religious narrative in Western civilization was actually a sophisticated piece of Roman propaganda, designed not to save souls, but to control minds? First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me and religion as it is. I know that, like me, you are interested in discovering and discussing those topics that seem to be hidden within our religions. Respecting all, we can talk about each one. If the topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you so much and enjoy. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial archaeological and historical investigations of our time. We're going to examine evidence that suggests the entire Christian story was engineered by a powerful Roman dynasty, crafted with surgical precision to pacify rebellious populations and consolidate imperial power. This isn't just another documentary questioning religious faith. This is a forensic examination of how empires manufacture belief systems to serve their political ends. By the time you finish watching this series, you'll understand why some of the world's leading biblical scholars are saying that Christianity, as we know it today, represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. You'll see archaeological evidence, literary analysis, and historical connections that have been hiding in plain sight for centuries. And you'll discover why this revelation isn't just important for understanding ancient history, but crucial for recognizing how power operates in our modern world. Let me be clear from the start. This investigation doesn't seek to destroy anyone's faith or diminish the positive impact that Christian teachings have had on millions of lives. Instead, we're asking a fundamental question that every thinking person should consider: how distinguish between genuine religious experience and carefully crafted social? Do we separate the spiritual wisdom from the political manipulation? How do we control? The story begins in the first century of the Common Era, in a volatile region of the Roman Empire called Judea. This wasn't the peaceful pastoral setting often depicted in Sunday school lessons. This was a powder keg of religious extremism, political rebellion, and imperial brutality. The Jewish population was seething under Roman occupation, inspired by ancient prophecies that promised a warrior Messiah would arise to drive out the foreign oppressors and restore Jewish independence. These weren't abstract theological discussions happening in quiet synagogues. These were real political movements with real military ambitions. Jewish rebels were launching guerrilla attacks against Roman installations, assassinating collaborators, and preparing for what they believed would be a divinely sanctioned war of liberation. They had their own literature, their own leaders, and their own version of messianic expectations that looked nothing like the turn-the-other-cheek philosophy we associate with Jesus. The Romans found themselves facing a unique challenge. Unlike other conquered peoples who could be pacified through traditional means, the Jews possessed something that made them extraordinarily difficult to control: a written religious tradition that explicitly commanded resistance to foreign rule and promised divine intervention on behalf of the faithful. These weren't just political rebels. They were religious warriors convinced that God Himself was on their side. Traditional Roman methods of suppression weren't working. Military force could crush individual uprisings, but it couldn't eliminate the underlying religious motivation that kept producing new generations of rebels. The Jewish scriptures themselves were the problem, filled with prophecies about a coming Messiah who would establish Jewish dominance over the Gentile world. As long as these texts existed and were believed, Jewish resistance would continue indefinitely. Enter one of Rome's most capable military families, the Flavians. Vespasian and his son Titus were experienced generals who understood that some problems couldn't be solved with swords alone. They had spent years fighting another rebellious religious group, the Druids in Britain and Gaul, and had learned valuable lessons about how to neutralize ideological resistance. The Druids had been eliminated not just through military conquest, but through the complete destruction of their religious literature and oral traditions. But the Jewish situation required a more sophisticated approach. The Jewish population was too large and too dispersed throughout the empire to simply eliminate. Their religious texts were too numerous and too widely distributed to destroy completely. And unlike the Druids, the Jews had already demonstrated their ability to survive cultural suppression and maintain their religious identity under foreign rule. The Flavians needed a different strategy entirely. Instead of trying to destroy Jewish religious literature, they would create their own version of it. Instead of crushing Jewish messianic expectations, they would fulfill them on their own terms. They would give the Jews their promised Messiah, but it would be a Messiah who preached obedience to Rome rather than rebellion against it. This wasn't an entirely original idea. The Romans had a long history of religious syncretism, blending local beliefs with Roman imperial ideology to create hybrid systems that served their political purposes. They had successfully adapted Egyptian, Greek, and Persian religious concepts to support Roman rule. The Jewish challenge simply required a more sophisticated version of this proven technique. The key insight was recognizing that the Jewish religious system contained within itself the seeds of its own transformation. The same scriptural traditions that inspired rebellion also contained alternative interpretations that could support accommodation with the Roman rule. The concept of a suffering Messiah existed alongside that of a conquering Messiah. The tradition of prophetic criticism of Jewish leadership could be redirected against those who opposed Roman authority. What the Flavians needed was a team of collaborators who understood Jewish religious literature intimately and could craft a new narrative that would appear authentically Jewish while serving Roman interests. They needed writers who could create a story so compelling, so emotionally satisfying, and so theologically sophisticated that it would capture the religious imagination of the Jewish population and redirect their messianic energies towards supporting rather than opposing Roman rule. The historical record shows us that such collaborators existed and were readily available. Wealthy Jewish families throughout the empire had already made their peace with Roman rule and were actively working to integrate Jewish religious traditions with Greco-Roman philosophical concepts. These weren't reluctant collaborators forced to work against their will. They were enthusiastic partners who saw an opportunity to create a new form of Judaism that could thrive within the Roman system. The most famous of these collaborators was a Jewish historian named Josephus, who had initially fought against Rome as a rebel commander, but switched sides after his capture and became a trusted advisor to the Flavian family. Josephus possessed exactly the combination of skills and knowledge needed for such a project: intimate familiarity with Jewish religious traditions, fluency in both Hebrew and Greek, understanding of Roman imperial ideology, and proven literary ability. But Josephus was not working alone. Archaeological evidence and historical records reveal a network of Jewish intellectuals, Roman officials, and wealthy patrons who were all invested in creating a new form of religious literature that could serve imperial purposes while maintaining the appearance of authentic Jewish origin. This wasn't a small conspiracy hatched in secret rooms. It was a major literary project involving some of the most talented writers and scholars of their era. The genius of their approach lay in understanding that the most effective propaganda doesn't look like propaganda at all. Rather than creating obviously Roman religious literature, they crafted stories that appeared to emerge organically from Jewish religious traditions while subtly incorporating themes and messages that served Roman political interests. The resulting texts would seem so authentically Jewish that even skeptical readers would accept them as genuine products of Jewish religious experience. The technical sophistication required for such a project cannot be overstated. These writers needed to create a narrative that would satisfy multiple audiences simultaneously. It had to appeal to Jewish religious sensibilities while not offending Roman political concerns. It had to incorporate enough authentic Jewish religious material to seem genuine, while introducing enough new elements to redirect Jewish messianic expectations. It had to be emotionally compelling enough to compete with existing rebel literature, while intellectually sophisticated enough to satisfy educated readers. Most importantly, it had to solve the fundamental problem that had made Jewish resistance so persistent. It had to provide a way for Jews to maintain their religious identity and sense of divine election while accepting Roman rule as legitimate and permanent. This required nothing less than a complete reinterpretation of Jewish messianic prophecy that would transform expectations of political liberation into hopes for spiritual salvation. The story they created would become the most influential piece of literature in human history. It would reshape not just Jewish religious thought, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. And according to the evidence we're about to examine, it accomplished exactly what its creators intended. It transformed a rebellious population into a pacified one, channeling revolutionary energy into spiritual contemplation and political submission. But before we dive into the specific evidence for this thesis, we need to understand the broader historical context that made such a project both necessary and possible. We need to examine the actual political situation in first-century Judea, the real nature of Jewish messianic expectations, and the documented methods that Roman imperial authorities used to manage religious and cultural resistance throughout their empire. Only then can we properly evaluate the extraordinary claim that Christianity itself was a Roman invention designed to serve imperial political purposes. Only then can we understand how a story created to control an ancient population continues to shape our world today. The political landscape of first-century Judea was far more complex and volatile than most people realize. This wasn't simply a matter of Roman soldiers patrolling peaceful villages where fishermen mended their nets and farmers tended their crops. This was a region in the grip of religious fanaticism, where apocalyptic expectations had reached fever pitch and multiple messianic movements were actively preparing for holy war against the occupying forces. To understand how Christianity could have emerged as a Roman creation, we first need to grasp the sheer intensity of Jewish resistance during this period. The Jewish population wasn't passively accepting foreign rule while quietly practicing their religion. They were actively organizing, recruiting, and planning what they believed would be the final battle between the forces of light and darkness, with their God fighting alongside them against the Roman legions. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in caves near Qumran in the 20th century provide us with an unfiltered glimpse into the mindset of these Jewish resistance movements. These documents, written by Jews for Jews with no intention that Romans would ever read them, reveal a worldview that was militaristic, exclusivist, and utterly incompatible with peaceful coexistence under foreign rule. The scrolls describe detailed preparations for a war that would last decades, with specific battle formations, weapons requirements, and ceremonial procedures for consecrating warriors before combat. They speak of the sons of light who would fight against the sons of darkness, with divine intervention ensuring victory for the chosen people. They outline rigid purity requirements for participants in this holy war, including detailed instructions for maintaining ritual cleanliness even during military campaigns. Most significantly, these documents reveal that Jewish messianic expectations were fundamentally political and military in nature. The coming Messiah wasn't envisioned as a gentle teacher who would transform hearts through moral instruction. He was expected to be a warrior king who would physically defeat Israel's enemies, restore Jewish independence, and establish Jerusalem as the center of a worldwide Jewish empire. These weren't fringe beliefs held by small extremist groups. Archaeological evidence suggests that messianic fervor had spread throughout Jewish society, from the religious elite in Jerusalem to rural communities in Galilee. Synagogue inscriptions, burial practices, and domestic artifacts all point to a population that was psychologically preparing for imminent divine intervention that would fundamentally transform the political order. The Romans initially attempted to manage this situation through their standard imperial playbook. They installed client rulers from the Herodian family, who were technically Jewish but completely dependent on Roman support for their power. They allowed Jewish religious practices to continue largely unchanged, exempting Jews from requirements to participate in imperial cult worship that were imposed on other subject populations. They even made accommodations for Jewish dietary laws and Sabbath observance in military service. But these concessions only seemed to intensify Jewish resistance rather than diminish it. The client rulers were viewed as illegitimate collaborators rather than authentic Jewish leaders. The religious exemptions were seen as temporary accommodations that would be unnecessary once the Messiah arrived to restore proper Jewish rule. Every Roman attempt at cultural sensitivity was interpreted through the lens of messianic prophecy as evidence that the empire was weakening and divine liberation was imminent. The situation reached a breaking point during the reign of Nero, when Jewish resistance movements began launching coordinated attacks against Roman installations throughout Judea. What started as isolated incidents of civil disobedience escalated into organized military campaigns, with Jewish rebels seizing control of major cities and establishing their own independent government. For the first time since the empire's expansion into the eastern Mediterranean, Rome faced a sustained ideologically motivated rebellion that threatened to inspire similar uprisings throughout their territories. The Roman response was swift and brutal, but also strategically sophisticated. Rather than simply crushing the rebellion through overwhelming military force, the Flavian generals recognized that they were dealing with a problem that required both military and intellectual solutions. They needed to defeat the Jewish armies in the field, but they also needed to neutralize the religious ideas that kept producing new generations of rebels. This is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because the historical record shows us that the Flavians didn't just fight a military campaign against Jewish rebels. They simultaneously launched what can only be described as a sophisticated psychological warfare operation designed to capture and redirect Jewish religious enthusiasm rather than simply suppress it. The evidence for this operation comes from multiple independent sources that have never been properly connected until recently. We have the military histories written by Josephus, documenting the Flavian campaign from an insider's perspective. We have archaeological remains from the siege of Jerusalem, showing the systematic nature of Roman operations. We have contemporary Roman literature, discussing the need for new approaches to managing religious resistance. And we have the Christian Gospels themselves, which contain internal evidence of their true origins when examined with the right analytical tools. What emerges from this evidence is a picture of the Flavians as remarkably sophisticated propagandists who understood that the most effective way to neutralize an ideology isn't to attack it directly, but to offer a more attractive alternative that serves your own purposes while appearing to fulfill your opponent's deepest aspirations. The key insight was recognizing that Jewish messianic expectations contained within themselves the possibility of multiple interpretations. The same scriptural passages that inspired military resistance could be reinterpreted to support spiritual transformation. The same prophecies that promised political liberation could be redirected toward personal salvation. The same texts that called for holy war against foreign oppressors could be made to advocate love for enemies and submission to earthly authorities. But this reinterpretation couldn't be imposed from outside. It had to appear to emerge organically from within Jewish religious tradition itself, presented by figures who possessed impeccable Jewish credentials and demonstrated intimate knowledge of Jewish scriptural interpretation. The Romans needed Jewish collaborators who could create what appeared to be authentically Jewish religious literature, while actually serving Roman imperial interests. The historical record shows that such collaborators were readily available and eager to participate in this project. Wealthy Jewish families throughout the empire had already recognized that their future lay in accommodation with Roman rule, rather than futile resistance. Many had sent to be their sons educated in Greek philosophy and Roman law, creating a generation of Jewish intellectuals who were culturally bicultural and politically pragmatic. These weren't reluctant participants coerced into betraying their people. They were enthusiastic partners who genuinely believed that creating a new form of Judaism, compatible with the Roman rule, would benefit both Jewish communities and the empire as a whole. They saw themselves as visionaries who could preserve the essential elements of Jewish religious tradition while eliminating the politically dangerous aspects that kept provoking Roman retaliation. The literary project they undertook was enormous in scope and breathtaking in its ambition. They needed to create not just a single text, but an entire library of interconnected documents that would provide a complete alternative to existing Jewish religious literature. These texts would need to be sophisticated enough to satisfy educated readers while accessible enough to appeal to common people. They would need to incorporate enough authentic Jewish material to seem genuine while introducing enough new elements to redirect Jewish religious energy away from political resistance. Most challenging of all, these texts would need to solve the fundamental theological problem that made Jewish resistance so persistent. They would need to explain why a loving and powerful God would allow His chosen people to remain under foreign rule, while simultaneously providing hope that this situation would eventually be resolved in a way that didn't require military rebellion against Rome. The solution they developed was ingenious in its psychological sophistication. Rather than denying Jewish chosenness or divine promises, they would reinterpret them in spiritual rather than political terms. Rather than abandoning messianic expectations, they would fulfill them through a Messiah who had already come and accomplished his mission through suffering and death rather than military victory. Rather than rejecting the idea of divine intervention in human affairs, they would relocate that intervention from the political sphere to the personal sphere, from this world to the next world, from collective liberation to individual salvation. The story they created would acknowledge Jewish suffering while explaining it as part of God's larger plan. It would validate Jewish hopes while redirecting them toward goals that posed no threat to Roman rule. It would preserve Jewish religious identity while making it compatible with permanent acceptance of foreign domination. And it would do all of this through a narrative so emotionally compelling and theologically sophisticated that it would not only satisfy Jewish audiences, but eventually appeal to Gentile populations throughout the empire. This wasn't simply a matter of writing new books and hoping people would read them. The creators of this literature understood that religious transformation requires more than intellectual persuasion. It requires emotional conversion, community support, and institutional structures that can sustain new beliefs over time. They needed to create not just texts, but an entire religious movement with its own leaders, its own practices, and its own sense of mission that would gradually replace existing forms of Jewish religious expression. The genius of their approach lay in making this new movement appear to be a natural evolution of existing Jewish traditions rather than an external imposition. The texts they created would present themselves as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies rather than innovations designed to serve contemporary political purposes. The leaders they promoted would claim authority based on divine revelation rather than Roman appointment. The practices they instituted would seem to emerge organically from Jewish religious experience rather than being imposed to serve imperial interests. But perhaps most importantly, this new religious movement would be designed to spread beyond Jewish communities into the broader Gentile population, creating a form of worship that could unify the diverse peoples of the Roman Empire under a single religious system that supported rather than challenged imperial authority. The evidence suggests that this project succeeded beyond its creator's wildest dreams, not only pacifying Jewish resistance, but eventually becoming the official religion of the empire itself. But to understand how this transformation occurred, we need to examine the specific literary techniques and historical parallels that reveal the true origins of the Christian story. The literary techniques used to create this new religious narrative were far more sophisticated than anything previously attempted in the ancient world. The authors weren't simply writing propaganda pamphlets or crude political manifestos. They were crafting what would become some of the most psychologically compelling and literarily complex texts in human history, using advanced compositional methods that wouldn't be fully understood by scholars until nearly 2,000 years later. At the heart of their approach was a technique that ancient Jewish writers called typology, a method of connecting different stories and characters across time by having them share similar patterns of names, locations, and sequential events. This wasn't random coincidence or loose thematic similarity. This was precise literary engineering, where specific details would be deliberately echoed between different narratives to create hidden connections that only informed readers would recognize. The genius of typological writing lay in its ability to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. Surface readers would encounter what appeared to be straightforward historical accounts or religious teachings, but educated readers who understood the technique would recognize the deeper patterns and realize they were reading carefully constructed literature that was referencing and reinterpreting earlier sources. This method allowed the creators of the Christian texts to accomplish something remarkable. They could present their new religious narrative as both historically accurate and prophetically significant, while actually basing it entirely on existing literary sources that had been systematically modified to serve their purposes. Every major episode in the Jesus story could appear to be a unique historical event, while actually being a typological adaptation of earlier material. The most obvious example of this technique appears right at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, where the author creates what scholars recognize as a deliberate parallel between the infancy of Jesus and the story of Moses in the Old Testament. Both narratives feature a patriarch named Joseph who travels to Egypt, a ruler who massacres innocent children, divine intervention that saves the chosen child, and a return journey that leads to the Promised Land. These parallels aren't coincidental similarities that happen to occur in two different historical periods. They're deliberate literary constructions designed to establish Jesus as a new Moses, the next great prophet in Jewish salvation history. The Gospel author is using typology to make a theological argument. Just as Moses was the first Savior of Israel, Jesus represents the second and final Savior who will complete what Moses began. But this is just the primer, the introductory example that teaches readers how to recognize the typological method being used throughout the text. Once you understand that the Gospel authors are deliberately creating these kinds of parallel patterns, you can begin to see similar connections everywhere in their work. And when you start looking for these patterns systematically, you discover something that completely changes how we understand the origins of Christianity. The entire ministry of Jesus, from his first appearance at the Sea of Galilee to his final crucifixion outside Jerusalem, follows a precise typological parallel with the military campaign that the Roman general Titus conducted against Jewish rebels 40 years later. Not loose thematic similarities, not general geographical coincidences, but exact sequential matches involving specific locations, parallel character names, and identical concepts occurring in the same order. This discovery represents nothing gun that less than the smoking proves the Roman origins of Christianity. Because while it might be possible to explain away a few scattered similarities as coincidence, it's mathematically impossible for dozens of complex parallels to occur in identical sequence unless one narrative was deliberately constructed to mirror the other. The implications are staggering. If the gospel narratives were written after Titus's military campaign and deliberately structured to parallel that campaign, then the entire story of Jesus becomes something fundamentally different from what billions of people have believed for 2 millennia. Instead of historical accounts of a divine figure who lived and taught in first-century Palestine, we're looking at sophisticated literary compositions that use the story of a Roman military victory as the hidden template for creating a fictional religious narrative. But to understand how this literary construction actually worked, we need to examine specific examples of these typological parallels and see how the gospel authors transformed historical military events into religious teachings that would serve Roman imperial interests. The pattern begins at the Sea of Galilee, where both Jesus and Titus launched their respective campaigns. In the gospel account, Jesus approaches fishermen who are working by the lake and tells them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." In Josephus's historical account, Titus arrives at the same location with his troops, attacks Jewish rebels who are attempting to escape in fishing boats, sinks their vessels, and captures the survivors using spears and nets, literally making his soldiers fishers of men. The parallel is unmistakable, but it's also deeply disturbing when you realize what it means. The gospel authors have taken a brutal military operation in which Roman soldiers slaughtered Jewish civilians and transformed it into a peaceful religious teaching about spiritual conversion. They've turned mass murder into a metaphor for evangelism, using the actual deaths of Jewish rebels as raw material for creating inspirational stories about following Jesus. This pattern continues throughout both narratives, as Jesus and Titus follow identical geographical routes through Galilee toward Jerusalem. At each major location, the gospel authors have created religious episodes that correspond to military events from Titus's campaign, systematically transforming Roman victories over Jewish resistance into teachings about spiritual transformation and submission to authority. At Gadara, Titus fights a major battle where Jewish rebels are driven into the sea and drowned. In the corresponding gospel episode, Jesus encounters a man possessed by a legion of demons, casts them out, and sends them into a herd of pigs that rushes into the water and drowns. The military terminology is preserved, the location is identical, and the outcome is the same. But the Roman military victory has been disguised as a story about Jesus' power over evil spirits. The psychological manipulation involved in this transformation is breathtaking in its cynicism. Jewish readers encountering these gospel stories would be unconsciously processing accounts of their own people's military defeats, but in a form that made those defeats seem like spiritual victories. They would be emotionally identifying with narratives that actually celebrated the destruction of Jewish resistance, but presented in religious language that made submission to Rome appear to be God's will. As both campaigns progress toward Jerusalem, the parallels become even more specific and undeniable. Jesus sends messengers ahead to prepare for his arrival. Titus sends advance units to scout the approaches to the city. Jesus encounters a Samaritan who provides aid to a wounded traveler. Titus's legions are attacked near Samaria and then resupplied and reinforced. Jesus tells parables about building towers and calculating costs. Titus surveys Jerusalem's walls to determine the best locations for constructing siege towers. Each of these parallels demonstrates the same pattern. Historical military events from Titus's campaign are being systematically transformed into religious teachings that serve Roman political interests. Stories about Roman military planning become parables about spiritual wisdom. Accounts of Roman logistics become metaphors for discipleship. Descriptions of Roman siege tactics become teachings about the cost of following Jesus. The climax of both narratives occurs at Jerusalem itself, where the typological parallels become so numerous and specific that they create what can only be described as a literary fingerprint, proving the connection between the two stories. Jesus predicts that Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies and its temple destroyed. Titus surrounds Jerusalem with a siege wall and destroys the temple. Jesus drives merchants from the temple courtyard. Titus captures the temple courtyard and drives out the Jewish defenders. Jesus predicts that not one stone will be left upon another. Titus's forces systematically demolish the temple structure. But perhaps the most chilling parallel involves the crucifixion narrative itself. In Josephus's account, Titus discovers that his friend Josephus has found 3 of his acquaintances being crucified and requests their release. Titus grants the request. The 3 men are taken down from their crosses, and while 2 die from their injuries, 1 survives and recovers. In the Gospel account, Jesus is crucified alongside 2 others, dies on the cross, but then resurrects from the dead. The pattern is unmistakable. A historical event involving Josephus and Titus has been transformed into the central miracle of Christianity. The survival of 1 crucified man in the historical account becomes the resurrection of Jesus in the gospel narrative. Even the name connection is preserved, as Josephus becomes Joseph of Arimathea, the figure who requests Jesus' body and arranges for his burial. When you recognize these patterns, you begin to understand that the gospel narratives aren't historical accounts that happen to contain some coincidental similarities to later military events. They're sophisticated literary compositions that use historical events as their hidden structural foundation while presenting themselves as religious revelations. Every major episode in the Jesus story corresponds to a specific event from Titus's military campaign, transformed through typological techniques into religious teachings that promote submission to Roman authority. This discovery fundamentally changes how we must understand the origins and purpose of Christianity. If the gospel narratives were constructed using Roman military victories as their template, then Christianity wasn't a grassroots religious movement that emerged organically from Jewish spiritual seeking. It was a carefully engineered propaganda operation designed to neutralize Jewish resistance by redirecting messianic expectations away from political liberation toward spiritual salvation. The sophistication required for such an operation cannot be overstated. The authors needed intimate knowledge of Jewish religious literature, fluency in Greek literary techniques, understanding of Roman imperial ideology, and access to detailed historical accounts of military operations. They needed to create narratives that would satisfy multiple audiences simultaneously while advancing specific political objectives. And they needed to do all of this in a way that would remain undetected for nearly 2,000 years. The evidence suggests they succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. Not only did their literary creation pacify Jewish resistance in the short term, it eventually became the dominant religious system throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The same narrative techniques that were originally designed to serve the political interests of a single imperial dynasty became the foundation for a global religious tradition that continues to shape human civilization today. But understanding the true origins of these texts doesn't just change how we interpret ancient history. It provides crucial insights into how propaganda operates in our own time, how religious narratives can be manufactured to serve political purposes, and how even the most cherished beliefs may have origins that are far different from what their adherents imagine. The question becomes, If Christianity was indeed a Roman creation designed for political purposes, what does that mean for the billions of people who have found meaning, comfort, and moral guidance in Christian teachings over the centuries? And what does it reveal about the relationship between religious faith and political power that continues to shape our world today? These are questions that go to the heart of how we understand the relationship between truth and belief, between historical fact and spiritual experience, between the origins of ideas and their ultimate value. As we continue examining the evidence for the Roman creation of Christianity, we'll need to grapple with these deeper philosophical questions about the nature of religious truth itself. But first, we need to understand exactly how the Flavian family was able to execute such an ambitious literary project, who their collaborators were, and what archaeological evidence exists to support these extraordinary claims about Christianity's true origins. The archaeological evidence supporting the Flavian creation of Christianity isn't hidden in obscure academic journals or locked away in Vatican archives. Much of it has been sitting in plain sight for decades, scattered across museum collections, ancient coin hoards, and early Christian burial sites throughout the former Roman Empire. The problem hasn't been a lack of physical evidence, but rather a lack of scholars willing to connect the dots and ask uncomfortable questions about what that evidence actually reveals. The breakthrough came when researchers began systematically comparing the symbols, imagery, and iconography used by the Flavian dynasty with the earliest known Christian artifacts. What they discovered was a pattern of shared symbolism so extensive and specific that it could not possibly be coincidental. The same images that appeared on Flavian coins, architectural decorations, and imperial monuments were simultaneously appearing in Christian catacombs, burial inscriptions, and religious artifacts throughout the empire. The most striking example involves a symbol that has puzzled archaeologists for generations: an anchor surrounded by dolphins or fish, sometimes accompanied by a trident or other maritime imagery. This symbol appears thousands of times on coins minted during the brief reign of Emperor Titus, Vespasian's son and co-creator of the Christian narrative. But the same symbol also appears extensively in the earliest Christian burial sites, particularly in the catacombs of St. Domitilla in Rome, which are considered among the oldest physical evidence of Christianity in existence. The traditional explanation for this shared symbolism has been that early Christians adopted pagan imagery and baptized it for their own purposes, transforming secular symbols into religious ones through reinterpretation. But this explanation falls apart when you examine the chronological evidence more carefully. The Christian use of these symbols doesn't appear to be a later adaptation of earlier pagan imagery. Instead, both the imperial and Christian uses of these symbols seem to have emerged simultaneously during the Flavian period, suggesting a coordinated rather than coincidental development. Even more significant is the identity of the people associated with these early Christian sites. The catacombs of St. Domitilla weren't named after a random Christian convert who happened to donate land for burial purposes. Domitilla was the granddaughter of Emperor Vespasian and the niece of Emperor Titus. She was a core member of the Flavian imperial family, with direct access to the highest levels of Roman political power. The idea that she independently converted to a religion that was supposedly being persecuted by her own relatives strains credibility beyond the breaking point. But Domitilla wasn't alone. Historical records reveal that numerous members of the Flavian family and their immediate circle were among the earliest Christian saints and leaders. Titus Flavius Clemens, who was either Domitilla's husband or close relative, is recorded in Catholic tradition as one of the first bishops of Rome after the apostles. Clement of Alexandria, whose full name was also Titus Flavius Clemens, wrote some of the earliest systematic descriptions of Christian symbolism and identified the anchor and fish as primary Christian images. This pattern of Flavian family involvement in early Christianity extends far beyond a few isolated individuals. When you map out the network of people associated with the earliest Christian communities in Rome, you find that an extraordinary number of them have documented connections to the Flavian imperial household. These aren't peripheral figures who might have converted independently. These are central characters in Christian origin stories who possessed the wealth, education, and political connections necessary to launch and sustain a new religious movement. The implications become even more striking when you examine the geographical spread of early Christianity. Rather than emerging organically from Jewish communities in Palestine and gradually spreading westward through grassroots evangelism, Christianity appears to have been simultaneously established in major urban centers throughout the Roman Empire, particularly in cities with strong imperial administrative presence. The pattern suggests coordinated implementation rather than organic growth, as if the new religion were being systematically introduced through existing imperial networks rather than spreading through independent missionary activity. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii and Herculaneum provides particularly compelling support for this thesis. These cities were buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, just 2 months after Titus became emperor, creating a perfect time capsule of life during the early Flavian period. Among the artifacts preserved in these cities are examples of the anchor and fish symbolism that would later become associated with Christianity, but appearing in clearly secular contexts that predate any known Christian presence in the region. Most remarkably, excavations at Herculaneum have uncovered a floor mosaic depicting an anchor surrounded by fish and human figures swimming toward it, located in what was clearly a wealthy private residence. The imagery is virtually identical to symbols found in Christian catacombs, but the archaeological context proves it existed before Christianity supposedly reached the area. This suggests that the symbols we associate with early Christianity were actually imperial imagery that was later adopted by Christian communities, not the reverse. The coin evidence provides even more specific connections between Flavian imperial propaganda and Christian symbolism. During Titus's brief reign, the imperial mint produced thousands of coins featuring the anchor and dolphin imagery, often accompanied by inscriptions referring to salvation, hope, and divine protection. These weren't random decorative choices. They were carefully selected symbols that conveyed specific political messages about the Flavian dynasty's role as saviors and protectors of the empire. But here's where the evidence becomes truly extraordinary. The same symbolic vocabulary appears in Christian texts from the same period, using identical Greek terminology and conceptual frameworks. When the Gospel of John has Jesus declare himself the anchor of the soul, or when early Christian writers describe converts as fish caught in the net of salvation, they're not creating original metaphors. They're using precisely the same symbolic language that was being simultaneously promoted through imperial propaganda campaigns. The linguistic analysis reveals even deeper connections. Scholars who have studied the Greek vocabulary used in the earliest Christian texts have identified numerous terms and phrases that appear nowhere else in Jewish religious literature of the period, but are common in Roman imperial inscriptions, legal documents, and official correspondence. The Gospel writers weren't using the everyday Greek that would be natural for Jewish authors writing for Jewish audiences. They were using the specialized vocabulary of Roman imperial administration. This linguistic fingerprint extends to the literary structure of the Christian texts themselves. The Gospels aren't written in the narrative style typical of Jewish religious literature or the biographical format common in Hellenistic historical writing. Instead, they follow patterns found in Roman imperial propaganda, with their emphasis on fulfilling prophecies, demonstrating divine approval of political authority, and promoting submission to established power structures. Even the geographical knowledge displayed in the Christian texts points to Roman rather than Jewish authorship. The Gospel narratives demonstrate detailed familiarity with Roman military procedures, imperial administrative structures, and political relationships that would be natural for Roman court historians, but unusual for Palestinian Jewish writers. Conversely, they contain geographical and cultural errors about Jewish life in first-century Palestine that suggest their authors were writing from outside the region based on second-hand information. The manuscript tradition provides additional evidence for Roman origins. The earliest surviving Christian texts aren't written on the papyrus that would be typical for Jewish religious documents from Palestine, but on high-quality parchment that was expensive and primarily used for imperial documents. The handwriting styles, decorative elements, and production techniques all point to professional scriptoriums operating under imperial patronage rather than informal Jewish religious communities. Perhaps most significantly, the textual variants found in early Christian manuscripts reveal systematic editing and revision processes that are consistent with official document production rather than organic religious literature. Different versions of the same texts show evidence of coordinated changes designed to enhance their political messaging, remove potentially problematic references, and align their content with evolving imperial policy. This isn't the kind of textual development you would expect from grassroots religious movements preserving oral traditions. It's what you would expect from official propaganda being refined through multiple drafts to maximize its effectiveness. The archaeological evidence from Christian burial sites reinforces this pattern. Rather than the simple, humble graves you might expect from a persecuted religious minority, the earliest Christian burials show evidence of significant wealth and political connections. The catacombs weren't hidden refuges where Christians practiced their faith in secret. They were elaborate burial complexes that required substantial financial resources and official permissions to construct. The art, inscriptions, and burial goods found in these sites reflect the tastes and resources of the Roman elite rather than marginalized Jewish converts. When you combine all of this archaeological evidence with the literary analysis revealing the typological connections between the Gospels and Josephus's military histories, a clear picture emerges of Christianity as a sophisticated imperial project rather than an organic religious movement. The physical evidence supports the textual evidence, and both point to the same conclusion. Christianity was created by Roman imperial authorities using the literary talents of collaborating Jewish intellectuals to serve specific political purposes. But understanding how this project was executed requires examining the broader network of relationships that made it possible. The Flavians didn't operate in isolation. They were supported by an extensive network of wealthy patrons, skilled writers, and political allies who all had reasons to support the creation of a new religious system that could unify the diverse populations of the Roman Empire under imperial authority. The most important of these collaborators were the members of wealthy Jewish families who had already made their accommodation with the Roman rule, and saw an opportunity to create a form of Judaism that could thrive within the imperial system. These weren't reluctant participants forced to betray their people. They were enthusiastic partners who genuinely believed that religious innovation was necessary for Jewish survival in the Roman world. The historical record reveals extensive connections between these Jewish collaborators and the Flavian imperial household, connections that go far beyond what could be explained by coincidence or independent conversion. These relationships were political, financial, and intellectual partnerships that provided both the motivation and the means for creating the Christian narrative. Understanding these relationships helps explain not just how Christianity was created, but why it was created in the specific form that it took. The gospel narratives weren't random collections of moral teachings and miracle stories. They were carefully crafted responses to specific political problems that the Roman Empire was facing in managing its Jewish populations. Every major theme in Christian theology can be understood as addressing a particular challenge that Roman imperial authorities were encountering in their efforts to maintain control over rebellious Jewish communities. The emphasis on spiritual rather than political salvation redirected Jewish messianic expectations away from military resistance toward personal transformation. The focus on love for enemies and forgiveness of persecutors provided religious justification for accepting Roman rule rather than fighting against it. The promise of rewards in the afterlife offered compensation for accepting subordinate status in this life. The establishment of a hierarchical church structure created an alternative to traditional Jewish religious authority that was compatible with Roman imperial administration. Each of these elements served specific Roman political interests while appearing to emerge naturally from Jewish religious traditions. The genius of the project lay in making imperial propaganda look like authentic Jewish religious revelation, creating a form of controlled opposition that would channel Jewish religious energy in directions that supported rather than threatened Roman rule. But the ultimate success of this project depended on more than just creating compelling literature and establishing supportive institutions. It required a systematic campaign to promote the new religious narrative while suppressing alternative versions of Jewish messianic expectations that continued to inspire resistance to Roman authority. The evidence suggests that this campaign was remarkably successful, not only in pacifying Jewish resistance in the short term, but in creating a religious system that would eventually become the dominant cultural force throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The same narrative techniques that were originally designed to serve the narrow political interests of a single imperial dynasty became the foundation for a global religious tradition that continues to shape human civilization today. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the positive impact that Christian teachings have had on millions of people throughout history. But it does reveal the complex relationship between religious faith and political power, and it raises important questions about how we distinguish between authentic spiritual insight and sophisticated social control. As we continue examining the evidence for the Roman creation of Christianity, we need to consider what this revelation means for our understanding of religious authority, historical truth, and the ongoing influence of ancient propaganda techniques in our contemporary world. The transformation of Jewish messianic literature into Roman imperial propaganda required more than just literary skill and political connections. It demanded a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, religious symbolism, and the mechanics of belief formation that wouldn't be formally studied by academics until the 20th century. The Flavian collaborators were essentially pioneering techniques of mass psychological manipulation that would later be refined by modern advertising agencies and political consultants. The key insight driving their approach was recognizing that the most effective way to change someone's beliefs isn't to attack those beliefs directly, but to provide an alternative narrative that appears to fulfill the same emotional and spiritual needs while actually serving different purposes. Rather than telling Jews to abandon their messianic expectations, the Christian narrative promised to fulfill those expectations in ways that posed no threat to Roman authority. This psychological sophistication extended to every aspect of how the Christian story was constructed and disseminated. The Gospel authors understood that religious conversion requires emotional engagement, not just intellectual persuasion. They crafted narratives that would trigger powerful emotional responses, while subtly reshaping the reader's understanding of what those emotions meant and how they should be expressed. The miracle stories, for example, weren't included simply to demonstrate Jesus' divine power. They were carefully designed to redirect Jewish expectations about how divine intervention operates in the world. Traditional Jewish messianic literature promised that God would intervene directly in political affairs, destroying Israel's enemies and establishing Jewish dominance over the Gentile world. The Christian miracle stories promised divine intervention in personal affairs, healing individual suffering while leaving political structures unchanged. This redirection of divine expectations from the political to the personal realm was perhaps the most crucial element in the entire Christian project. By convincing Jews that God's primary concern was individual salvation rather than collective liberation, the gospel narratives effectively neutralized the religious motivation that had been driving Jewish resistance to Roman rule for generations. The psychological manipulation involved in this transformation was extraordinarily sophisticated. The Christian narrative didn't deny Jewish suffering or dismiss Jewish hopes for divine intervention. Instead, it reframed that suffering as spiritually meaningful and promised that divine intervention was indeed coming, but in a form that would complement rather than challenge Roman imperial authority. The crucifixion story represents the pinnacle of this psychological manipulation. By transforming the Roman execution of a Jewish rebel into a voluntary sacrifice by the Son of God, the Gospel authors created a narrative that made Jewish suffering under Roman rule appear to be part of God's redemptive plan, rather than evidence of Roman oppression. Jews who had lost family members to Roman crucifixions could find meaning in those deaths by identifying them with Jesus' sacrificial death, but this identification actually reinforced acceptance of Roman authority rather than inspiring resistance to it. The resurrection narrative completed this psychological transformation by promising that apparent defeat was actually victory, that submission to earthly authority would be rewarded with eternal authority, and that patient endurance of injustice would ultimately be vindicated by divine justice. These themes provided emotional comfort to subjugated populations while encouraging them to accept their political subordination as temporary and spiritually meaningful. The genius of this approach lay in its ability to satisfy genuine human needs for meaning, hope, and dignity, while channeling the expression of those needs in directions that served imperial interests. The Christian narrative didn't simply suppress Jewish religious aspirations. It redirected them toward goals that were compatible with permanent Roman domination. But creating psychologically compelling narratives was only part of the challenge facing the Flavian propaganda operation. They also needed to establish institutional structures that could preserve and transmit their new religious system across generations while maintaining its essential political functions. This required creating a form of religious organization that would appear authentically Jewish while actually operating according to Roman administrative principles. The evidence we've examined tonight reveals a truth that reshapes our understanding of Western civilization itself. Christianity, the faith that has inspired billions and fundamentally altered the course of human history, emerges not as divine revelation, but as sophisticated Roman statecraft. The Flavian dynasty didn't just conquer Jewish resistance through military might. They transformed it into spiritual submission through literary genius. This revelation doesn't diminish the profound meaning millions have found in Christian teachings, nor does it invalidate the moral wisdom embedded within these ancient texts. What it does reveal is how power operates across millennia, how empires manufacture belief systems to serve their ends, and how even our most sacred narratives may have origins far different from what we've been taught. As we face our own era of information warfare and manufactured consent, understanding how the Romans engineered Christianity provides crucial insights into recognizing manipulation in our contemporary world. The same techniques that redirected Jewish messianic fervor toward Roman political goals continue to shape how authority figures use religious and ideological narratives to control populations today. The question isn't whether Christianity is true or false, but whether we can distinguish between authentic spiritual insight and sophisticated social engineering. The Flavians left us more than a religion. They left us a case study in how human consciousness can be captured and redirected through masterful storytelling. History's greatest story may indeed have been its greatest lie, but recognizing that fact doesn't diminish us. It empowers us to think more critically about the narratives that shape our world, to question the origins of our most fundamental beliefs, and to reclaim our capacity for independent thought in an age of endless manipulation. The truth, as they promised, has indeed set us free.